So just at the end of the last session, I talked about starting to work in Pangnirtuuq, uh, mainly running this program with the students. So a lot of it's focused around the students. A lot of things happen there which are of great interest. But the three people that we worked with very closely for most of the time I was there were other people as well, but for most of the time, were Evie Ananiliak, Jaco Ishulutak, and Johannes Ichapik. And they all, in many, many different ways, sort of framed and expanded a lot of my thinking and understanding about Inuit. Things would happen like, for example, I had taught the students that in the naming system that women often dream of a dead relative coming to visit them or a dead relative coming to have tea, and that dream tells them what the name of the child, what child wants to be reborn. And I had told this to the students. Now, I don't know why, but students seem to think, I guess because I'm white, I don't know nothing. So the students, again, never believe a word of what I said. So one day, we're doing a session with Evie and a couple of the other women. And so the students ask them, do you dream of the dead people coming back to visit you and, name your children after them? Oh, no, never heard of that. No, never happens. I'm thinking, oh, well, so it goes, that's life as an anthropologist. So after this session, the students go off, and the women are all sitting around having tea with one another, and I'm still sitting with the women, and they get into this incredibly interesting conversation about their dreams and understanding from their dreams, which person wanted to be reborn. And I said to them, I said, I do understand what you're saying. They said, yeah. I said, but you just told the students that this never happened, that you didn't know about this. They said, oh yeah, well they don't need to know about that, but you already know about it, so it's okay, you can hear it. I'm thinking, oh, for goodness sake, make a liar out of me, why don't you? But it was that kind of thing that sort of developing and enriching a lot of things that I had already understood. One of the other things that I came to realize, and it's a lot of the younger workers in anthropology and in Inuit studies, who these days not so many are learning to speak Inuktitut, which for all sorts of reasons I think is a real shame. But one of the problems with that is that a lot of the things that we've been talking about over this series of interviews, you only get in Inuktitut. You don't get it when people are speaking English. They don't translate it, so to speak. One of my classic examples was one of our interpreters who was working with us. She was introducing herself, and she had her young baby with her. And she said to the students in English, my name is Margaret, and this is my baby AJ, my son AJ. But when she switched into Inuktitut and was talking to the folks in Inuktitut, she said, well, they already knew her name was Margaret. She said, my name is Margaret, and this is my mother Ida. And I'm thinking, okay, I only get that because I can understand what she's saying in Inuktitut. By the way, that's not complicated Inuktitut to say that, but I only get that because I can understand what she's saying. But the students have missed out on a whole depth of relationship here that she won't speak in English. Again, you see so much of this flows in Inuktitut. And so I was telling you about the young woman who with a boy's name. I love visiting with her because, of course, it turns out that she actually has 26 names, just to make everybody's life easy. And I love visiting with her because of the sort of the way she's related to everybody in town. through all of these names is enormously complicated, and just even me barely kind of trying to keep track of it is it's just fascinating in the first place. So it really grieves me in some ways that a lot of the younger students are not learning to speak Inuktitut, because all of these things are talked about all the time in Inuktitut. But if you ask for it in English, and this is one of the lessons I learned in Pangnirtuuq, it never comes through. It's just not spoken about. And you know, you get things like I was sitting with Evie one day. We were out in camp. We used to take the students out to camp for 10 days. We were out in camp, and I was sitting with Evie, and one of the young Inuit guys came up to Evie and said, "Did you know there are caves in the hill just above us?" And Evie said, "I didn't know there were caves up there." He said, "Yeah, there are caves up there." She said, "Oh, well, that must be where the Tachiatsiut live." And I said, I didn't understand. I said, "What are Tachiatsiut?" And she said, "Well," she said, "they're the invisible people who live up in the caves up there." She said, "Chris, haven't you heard them at night?" And I said, "Like what?" She said, "You know, they're up there throwing rocks around and having fun and doing stuff to disturb us at night. Haven't you heard them?" Well, no, I guess I slept through that. And she, you know, we just got into this entire conversation about this. And at one point I said to her, "Well, you know, is this dangerous to the students? This is something we should be concerned about with the students." "Oh, no, they won't hurt anybody. They're just, you know, they're just up there and they're fine." Well, you know, you just get into these kind of conversations, and you first of all find that this stuff is very, very much alive, and part of the day-to-day discourse. But you have to be in the right situation. There were a couple of other things that I wanted to draw attention to. One was, and it comes out of Mark Stevenson's book, Mark Stevenson's book on Inuit whalers and cultural persistence. He has a discussion at the end there about different models of leadership in Inuit society, and I think there's something that's quite significant actually in that, and I observed it in our work in Pangnirtuuq. Usually, Joannesi was the Anglayochak, the senior leader in the group, and what Joannesi said happened. You know, if Joannesi said we were going to go hunting over here, we went hunting over there. If Joannesi said we were putting up our tents here, we put up our tents here. I mean, he was one of those really sort of, he was very powerful, but very central kind of authority within the camp. And the way it usually works is Joannesi would tell me what to do, and then I would tell all the students what to do. But one year, Joannesi had a heart attack. Now, just as a side story, I was in the boat with Joannesi when he had the heart attack. We were out in the middle of Cumberland Sound, and I have never been as scared in my life over, oh, what the hell are we going to do? We got to get this guy back to town now. He's having a heart attack. What do we do? Thank God I radioed Jaco. I was just about hysterical. I radioed Jaco on the radio, and Jaco brought his boat over, and we just plowed as fast as we could all the way to Pangnirtuuq and radioed ahead to Pangnirtuuq that he was sick. Anyways, Joannesi had a heart attack, and so the next year he was still not well. So leadership in our camp fell to Jaco. And Jaco, this is where you began to see some of the differences. Joannesi came from Nunatak, which is a camp just north of Pangnirtuuq. And it was a camp that was closely associated with the Lingayok, which is a camp where Angmalik went, one of the great leaders of Pangnirtuuq. That's where he went when the whaling closed. So he comes from that side of Pangnirtuuq. Jaco comes from the other side of the sound, the where Umanadjuak is. He comes from Qipisa. And in fact, although Jaco doesn't appear, that's the group of people that Jean Briggs did her work with for Inuit morality play, the Qipisa. So that's Jaco's folks, okay, on that side of sound. Jaco that summer brought along it's kind of like, a rabbit with all his friends and relations. He brought along all of his relatives, as far as I could tell, to our camp. And we had, his sisters and brothers-in-law and his brothers, and I mean, just everybody was there. Um, uh, they were all there. They were mainly from his wife's side of the family, actually. And it was really interesting because in any of the decisions that were being made, basically the men would gather at night and they'd sit around and drink tea for a couple of hours with each other and just sort of gently talk about what was happening, what they thought would happen, where they would go. And gradually a consensus would emerge of what we were going to do. I would sit in on these conversations. I would miss about 40 to 50% of them, but that's okay. I generally got what was going on. And through a much more sort of diffuse decision-making process, decisions were made in the camp. And out of that, I realized that, and again, going back and reflecting on some of the things that Mark Stevenson says, that there are some very, very different models for leadership in Inuit society. And I think you can actually put it at two kinds of extremes. The very centralized, powerful Angliokak guy, the kind of person that was represented by Joannesi. It doesn't mean, by the way, that they're mean or authoritarian. It's just that they're very centrally focused there. And at the other extreme, this kind of very diffuse, everybody being part of the discussion, consensus-building model of making decisions. And those represent two kinds of extremes from my point of view. But going back through the literature, and I think Mark Stevenson points to those extremes, but going back and reading through the literature, one of the things that kind of struck me is, as you look at the camps, the development of camp relationships, the history of camp relationships, is that it's actually kind of it's kind of like what Edmund Leach describes in Political Systems of Highland Burma, the Gum Sao and the Gum La. Can't remember if I got it right, but anyways, how it's kind of a pendulum that swings back and forward between the two, and that as it approaches one, it sort of begins to move way back towards the other. It struck me that's actually quite a good model for understanding leadership in Inuit society. That there are these two extremes, which both represent a kind of idealized model, both of which the Inuit have and carry and represent. But as the pendulum swings, towards one end with the highly centralized authoritarian type of figure, the Angmaliks of the world, the Idlauts of the world, the Ituksarjuaks, those very famous camp leaders. At a certain point, it begins to swing back the other way, and you see power and seeping away from them, and then often in their latter years or as they die, it diffuses completely amongst all of the children, and it swings over to the other direction. And similarly with the at the other end of the spectrum, where you have this very diffuse, decentralized consensus model, eventually sort of competent, capable, dominant hunters begin to emerge and begin to assert sort of more authority in that, and it begins to swing in the other directions. So I think one of the things in understanding Inuit camp life, in understanding Inuit leadership, and this gets critical to the modern period, is that there are these two extremes, but the situation is always tending towards one or tending towards the other, never actually settling there, nor ever actually reaching the other extreme. But I think it's a better way of thinking about leadership in Inuit camps and understanding that. And it's certainly something that I've observed. So that comes out of the dynamic of working with both Jaco and Joannesi. The other thing with Jaco is that pretty well every year after the program finished, I would go with Jaco. We'd get in his boat and we'd head off, usually across to the far side of the Sound. Jaco's main purpose in doing this was to mine and get soapstone for carving. He's a brilliant carver, I think one of the finest carvers on Baffin Island. And he makes his living carving. His carvings are running the $10,000 to $12,000 range. This is pretty important stuff. And he had located a source of soapstone. It was I don't know if it still is, so I can't tell you where it is. It was a secret source on the far side of Cumberland Sound, and once a year he would exploit my labor, and we would go. Well, I paid for the gas. We'd go across Cumberland Sound. We'd spend about 10 days to 2 weeks hunting, fishing, clam collecting, and getting a boatload of the soapstone. The soapstone source was at the top of this hill, and Jaco would mine the stone out of the hill, and then you'd have to carry it down this pretty long hill, and you're carrying great big hunks of raw stone right down this hill. The bottom of the hill was a swamp and a little lake, and they had this skiff where you'd load the rocks into the skiff, right? And then you had to paddle like hell across the lake before the boat would sink, and see if you could make it just before the boat sunk, and then unload the rocks, empty the water out of the boat, and then carry it over another hill to where the main boat was so that you could take it home. But in those trips, it was just sort of the two of us just traveling together and talking about life, the world, everything that learned a tremendous amount. Jaco learned very quickly that I wanted to know the names of various places, the significance of those names. I really like the concept in Mark Nuttall's book of Memoryscape. He uses that at the front of his book to talk about places. And talking to somebody like Jaco, he was, there's a traditional story associated with this, and then my grandfather's family lived here, and then, I slept with my wife here for the first time, and now, it was just this ongoing story of these places. Absolutely wonderful experience. We would go over and visit Lipa Pitsulak. Now, Lipa Pitsulak was, of course, an incredibly famous and well-known artist and carver. Lipa had found living in Pangnirtuuq too busy for him, and so he had moved his entire family to this outpost camp about 80 miles outside of Pangnirtuuq at Upingnirvik. And we'd go over and we'd stay with Lipa. Staying with Lipa is probably the best storyteller I have ever encountered. He spoke Inuktitut with a kind of eloquence that I only know one other person who had that kind of eloquence, where I didn't always understand everything he said, but it was always said so nicely that I just didn't want to interrupt him to ask. He told me, for example, the Kiviak cycle of stories. His versions were not the versions I've ever seen published. It took him, we only ever got through 3 of the sequences, because it took him an hour and a half to 2 hours to tell each sequence. Most of the versions I've seen are much shorter than that. And he knew all of those stories. He knew all about shamanism, and I would sit up until 3 o'clock in the morning, sitting with Lipa as he would tell me stories and understanding, and how he understood shamanism. It was really amazing. And one of the other things I always like about Lipa is we'd sit up until 3 in the morning with him telling me these stories, and I would just be my mind would be boggling with this stuff, and I would curl up in my sleeping bag on the floor of the house. I sleep on the floor of the house, right? And in the morning, I would get kicked in the ribs. Wake up! Oh God, what? It's 8 o'clock in the morning. What do you want? It's time to say morning prayer. And he'd hand out the Anglican prayer books, and we'd all have to sit around in his living room and say morning prayer. And this is again the kind of thing that intrigues me. You could sit up all night with him speaking about shamanism, and then you're up at 8 o'clock in the morning to say morning prayer in the Anglican prayer book. He was a phenomenal person, in terms of his understanding of things. I remember that you walked into his house and there was this loon skin hung up on the wall. And so I said, why have you got a loon skin hanging on your wall? Well, of course, a loon is one of the primary shamanic figures or helpers, right? Because it can fly up into the sky and dive down into the ocean. Well, that was 2 hours of discussion right there on why this loon skin was hanging on his wall. But it was again the kind of experience where, in the living embodiment of Lipa, an enormous amount of traditional knowledge was held, and he was more than willing to share it. He had no problem sitting and talking to me about these things and telling those stories and whatnot. Of course, again, I never had a tape recorder. I never had a notebook. We were just visiting, right? The other thing that I learned in that, which was really important, and I learned this from Jaco, is Jaco would always take me down to the co-op before we went, and we'd buy up this pile of food. Well, I'd pay for it. He would choose it. Buy up this pile of food. And the first time we went down to visit Lipa, Jaco sort of organized and got me into making all of this food, and we would present it as a feast to Lipa's family. After that, Jaco expected me to do it on my own. So we'd buy up all of this food, we'd get to Lipa's place, and I would cook up and present this entire feast. It was hot dogs and stuff, but they lived out in the land. They didn't get hot dogs. This was a huge treat. It was really important to learn the sociability, the courtesies that go with the generous exchange of knowledge, and that was really what the experience with Lipa was all about. He was an amazing person to work with. I don't know that I could say that I added anything new to that I learned anything that was not already in the literature, but it did confirm to me that, one, the literature just wasn't all made up, and two, that there is still a living transmission of that kind of knowledge. So that was the beginning of the experience in Pangnirtuuq.